Hi, it's Susan from Worldpeacefull, and I was just watching Princess Diana documentary. In her words, where she describes this what appeared to be a fairy tale marriage, a British royal family wedding, and her as a very young woman, her experience, and in a sense, the tragedy of her life and the resurrection of her life. It had very much a Christ-like feeling to it. She even said in her own words that she was crucifying herself on the inside, and yet publicly she was seen as very happy, confident. And she travelled on a journey through intense pain and darkness to arrive at a place really in the end where it certainly appears that she did find happiness. Firstly, I want to just meditate for a few moments and go still to reflect on her life, because she was truly a light to the world and a gift. The impact she made on humanity was really extraordinary, the love that her presence and the type of person that she was evoked. So I'm just going to go still and in honour of that, really. Just first I'd like to say that I think that the greatest courage was really the fact that she didn't end her life, that she persevered through. And I think making a decision to deliver that role of Princess of Wales was incredibly courageous. Diana, virtually the day after she was married, it all went downhill for her. She loved Prince Charles, she states, and the great pain that she was experiencing was the fact that she was recognising that he loved someone else. That is the agony of your own dreams shattering. Her bulimia was a psychological reaction to emotional abuse, was what it really was. She explains that Prince Charles was indifferent to her suffering. He probably saw it as dramatic because this had been his life. He grew up with this. She hadn't. So this was a major adjustment for her to be under public scrutiny every moment. And also the insensitivity of the paparazzi. I've seen them in action in England, and I really don't agree with the idea that people believe that just because a person is a public figure means that they have no right to their own privacy and to live their own private life. Because there was so much money involved, these photojournalists became millionaires overnight just photographing her. So the frenzy was on. In a sense, her image was a commodity that was worth more than gold. So her personal needs, her as a human being, was completely discarded for the profit that people would make. She became an object. She symbolises really interesting reflections in respect of how women are treated. This idea that the woman must be the dutiful wife, the good mother. Women are held up in, this sort of esteem, and yet that person's own needs and wants are completely discarded as she is expected to sacrifice for the greater good. I do believe Diana was a very gentle, sensitive person. And Charles grew up in an emotionally bankrupt family. And I don't blame people per se. I can just see that it's that status, that higher class where they are being seen to be all the time. I've certainly worked with people of so-called status, and there's real investment in what you do, how much you have, how you are seen, the clothes that you wear, the brand images. It's like your whole worth is very much based on your net worth. When you're a royal, you're held in a light that's much greater than the average person. You are breeding, you are quality, you are wealth, you are adored because you're some monarch that is like a parent overseeing the people, very removed, totally disconnected from day-to-day life of ordinary people, because a royal person would never experience a life where they actually struggle to make money, where they have to, they would have domestic arguments, but maybe in the royal family in Britain it was more staid. They may well not have expressed. They would have suppressed their emotional state. So Charles, in a sense, was a product of that. He also was unable to marry the one he loved. And so Diana found herself in this position where really that was a showcase wedding. He knew he didn't love her, but clearly she'd been chosen, as she stated, and she was to perform that role. Her breakdown, her throwing herself down the stairs, her attempts on her own life, apparently 4 times, was all in response to this indifference, as she called it. Now, I can add something to this because I've been through experiences where I've confronted indifference to my own suffering, and I also wanted to finish. And others can easily judge. She was certainly judged as well, like she was unstable, had a problem, she was victim blamed, because the society at large has very little understanding of emotional abuse. If you've got bruises and you've been physically harmed, then people will say, right, that's wrong, this person's been physically abused. The emotional abuse is not well understood, although we are seeing more and more cases, and certainly here in Australia, royal commissions into child abuse, the mental health issues that more and more people are experiencing, their attempts to suppress it with antidepressants, which is absolutely not the way to go. I don't believe in taking medication in order to perform. I think you need to deal with if you're having an emotional reaction. And certainly when people are deprived of love or people are engaged in a situation where they're feeling and the other is not, and that other is engaging them in that situation but not able to emotionally respond to them, this is where the sort of the arrow turns inward. Diana would have blamed herself for her emotions, and being a woman too, if a woman cries and you've come from a background where people don't cry, it's all stiff upper lip, she was seen as weak, unstable definitely, and yet she wasn't. She was actually reacting normally to a situation where she was being deprived of that normal human relationship, that human bonding, which is necessary for mental health. But it's impossible for her to reach out to people. Apparently they did send her psychiatrist, and I think there was one that he said to her it wasn't her fault, and she said something changed within her when she heard those words, because clearly she'd blamed herself. Sort of the bulimia is kind of trying to bring out the toxins from within. It's not really about wanting to be skinny. It's an emotional response. She's eating herself up. She was also experiencing deep jealousy because she actually loved him. Although true love may not have been so jealous, it was probably more inadequacy that drove the jealousy, in that this other woman had his heart and she couldn't make him love her. That's when a person would be feeling like there's no way out. Desperation, she said. But at the same time, going through this sort of shadow, what do they say? The valley of the shadow of death is, I believe, a biblical term. Psalm 23, in actual fact, is called. That is part of the evolutionary experience also of the spirit rising to overcome what feels impossible to overcome. Because she was also dealing with, this constant attention, and she was a shy person, so it would have been she would have felt like she was exposed on every level. I think having her kids probably saved her, because she had something to direct her love to and receive love from. Because when you're in a space where no one loves you and you're performing, that would be very hard. I think what people loved about her was she was clearly a feeling person. And she started to blossom after she divorced Charles and started to go out into her charitable work. There's some footage of her in Angola talking about landmines and nursing children with, legs that had been blown off. And of course there'd be conjecture around whether her death was because of that, not just Dodie, who was her Middle Eastern partner. I lived near Harrods, and Dodie's father owned Harrods, which is a big department store in London for the rich and famous. I remember seeing gypsies around the outskirts of Harrods begging. I worked for a very famous woman in London, in Knightsbridge, and I got to have a look into the world. In fact, Princess Diana was on her Rolodex, they called it, which is the revolving index of all these famous names. This woman was a famous choreographer that I worked for, and I worked downstairs with her secretary, so it was very much depicting the upstairs downstairs idea. There used to be a program here in Australia called Upstairs Downstairs, and all the servant staff were downstairs and the rich and famous were upstairs. And I did cross paths with a few rich and famous people. Certainly had an insight into a very wealthy person's life, where she didn't know whether, I always remember this, spending £40 on getting a window cleaned was too expensive or not. And yet she had Learjets, and she had places in New York and the Riviera, France. She was incredibly wealthy, and yet, interesting enough, she married a husband who actually, I think he was gay, and he was after that Rolodex. He wanted to connect with her so that he could, access his career better. So people, will marry people that they think are well connected. She didn't actually know he was gay when they first married. She had no idea, but she found out. And I got to learn about the parties. And I talked to her a bit too. We talked about creativity because she was an artist herself. And the fact that you've got to keep working at creativity to develop it. But I didn't feel that she was a happy woman. She lived in a bubble. I remember one of her friends passed away, or before they passed away, actually. She believed that they wouldn't die until she saw them. Such was her belief in how important she was. So that inequality was very evident. I remember when I worked there, I had no envy of wealth and status. I've been very lucky. I'm very much an egalitarian. I see everybody the same. I don't think just because someone has money that they're better than me. I can be uncomfortable with certain people who have certain expectations of behaviour. I prefer to be myself, so I'm not trained in those areas, which in a way is good. My experience of Britain was, it was a complicated culture. Certainly wasn't as easygoing as Australia. There were definite class aspects in the sense that I remember working in a satellite children's channel for a time, and I wanted to talk directly to the boss. And being an Australian, we talk directly to people. But I had to talk via someone to her, and it was the weirdest experience I'd had, that I couldn't actually go direct. And I worked in a research company there too, and Australians are very direct. If we have a problem, we just go and talk to the person. And they find that quite confronting. But it's very hard to not be that way if you've been raised in a culture where people just say what they think. It was quite interesting to move around that society. You know, I lived in a place called Southeast Penge with a friend of mine who I'd met in Australia. She was British, and I was married at the time. And we stayed there for a while. So that was your typical sort of two-story flat. You know, she didn't have 2 stories to her flat, but you had to go up to the second story to get into her flat. And they were very tiny flats, and there was quite a lot of costs. You know, they had poll tax, and you had a tax on the television, TV license. You know, there was obviously gas and water. In Australia, we didn't have that many on costs. It was a lot cheaper in Australia. It was also very cold in winter, and you really felt the icy cold there. And for those who didn't have a lot of money, they would find it very difficult to heat their place. Some of the places were very poor conditions because it was an old city. London's a very old city, one of the most expensive cities in the world. So you don't have a lot of money left over. I remember, I think I was earning about £15,000 a year, and I think my husband was earning about $18,000. He was an engineer, and I worked as a temp, so I got to move around. I also worked as a research analyst, but that was a little bit later. So there was very much, this is the way we do things around here. I had good times too, like, you know, when I went out for drinks with colleagues and what have you. The reason I'm sort of taking you through this journey of living in Britain is because I'm sort of still deeply reflecting on Diana as I'm going through this. I'm actually looking into class distinctions. I wrote diaries in London. I wrote a lot of diaries as I was going through a lot of deep exploration within myself at that time. I was also looking into things like the I Ching, Chinese philosophy. I got inspired around that. And yeah, it was for me, I was also going through a very painful time at times as well. I found the British very difficult. I wasn't necessarily really happy there. Found it a struggle. I found it interesting too that if you wanted to open a bank account, your employer had to approve it. So there was a real structure that you had to fit in order to access things. I also remember working in curriculum and corporate advertisers were putting their brand images on test papers and curriculum documents. That was a subliminal way of influencing children at that time. And I remember thinking, this is not good for children and it shouldn't be allowed, but they were sponsors of those curriculum designers or developers. I worked in quite a lot of different places when I was there. Another experience I had was, I remember Blackfriars, which is an old part of London. It's in the city. And I ended up walking in a churchyard. I got a bit lost. I think I was near Embankment. Can't quite remember now. I'd have to look at a London Underground map to see how close they are. But I do remember walking into this old churchyard and found out later it was actually the scene of the Plague of London, and there were big burial mounds there where they buried the bodies after the plague. So it was hard life. The British have had a really tough time. Austerity, poverty, isolation. It can be quite a hard-hearted place. That's what I felt when I was there. Anyway, as I walked into this churchyard, there was some men drinking, and he goes to me, "Spare change, love?" And I only had £10. Well, I had £10, I mean no spare change. So I turned around and gave him the £10 and he was so happy. And then I remember walking out thinking, did I just enable him, giving him £10 to go and buy another bottle now? And then I thought, you know what? The joy on his face from getting the £10 was worth it. If I made him feel happy, and I was very kind to him. And in this churchyard, there was only one way in and one way out. So I just obviously came in that churchyard to give him that £10 and leave. You could say a higher power led me in there. He was obviously praying because he was drinking. He was very spiritual. And I remember being in the double-decker buses, and watching the people. I used to look at the Caribbean people, the dark-skinned people and the white-skinned people. And I used to look to see whether they actually smiled at each other or looked at each other. I was always very interested in how people were interacting. Were they kind? I always remember the homeless in the London Underground. My friend was stepping over them, and I vowed to myself I will never ever step over a homeless person. I will never allow myself to become complacent, was what happened. So I can feel myself moving back to Diana now. That feeling of compassion is what links me to her. Also, the pain and distress of psychological abuse definitely links me to her. And my deep love of humanity, her ability to feel for people and move the hearts of, if not billions around the world. It wasn't that she was so beautiful, it was that she was sensitive, and ordinary people related to that. She also talked about the importance of giving a lot of love to her children. And she really knew that that's the human need, because she'd been starved herself. And that's bulimia, is starving yourself. So that's actually what that bulimia means. Bulimia means it's actually a psychological starving of yourself. So she starved herself. She was starved of affection. And that manifested from the inside world to the outside of her life. So what I'm saying is your inner world actually reflects your outer. What you feel inside manifests outside. So her starving desperation became bulimia. I'm just going into my own experience because I didn't go through a bulimia, so I wasn't starving. I was actually confused. I didn't understand why people weren't responding. And I think for me, when I expressed my distress, the fact that there was no response was really hard to deal with, because it was like my life wasn't valued. Therefore, I didn't value my life. See? That's why I wanted to end it, because inside I wasn't valuing my life, because my value came from outside myself at that time. I'm just going to check on that. Is that true? The psychological abuse is when people get the experience of not having any value. So you might find in abuse situations a parent ignores the child. Certainly in the baby houses in Russia, when I went there with Patch Adams, they were saying that the children would become crazy if they weren't given love. So love is a very, very basic human requirement for mental health and human health. So if you starve a person of affection by disconnecting from them, by not feeling them, and that person who's doing it may well not have received appropriate modelling or bonding from their own family. So for them, that's their normal. But for the one who's feeling and deeply caring, that's not their normal. So that person will feel they'll blame themselves is essentially what happens. I know I did. But it actually wasn't about me. It was about the other who wasn't able to communicate and take ownership or responsibility for their part. And I found that I was unable to move on until it was resolved for me. I needed to understand what it was, because I didn't really know what it was. I didn't understand why I was suffering to the extent that I was, because it's not something you can see. It's invisible. And so you end up in these circles of, or you could call them spirals actually, downward spirals, where you feel trapped and you can't find an exit. And I know Diana said she felt that. She felt trapped, unable to exit. So what I'm suggesting here is that there are similar emotional responses to this emotional detachment, this inability to communicate on a human level. So there's a real message for many men in this, because I know that many men are not encouraged to show their feeling because it's vulnerable and so forth. And they may not have many role models that are deeply feeling men. Typically that's seen as being weak or feminine when it's actually human. There's a real huge misunderstanding around the emotions. Emotional intelligence is what is touched when a person is kind and compassionate and inspirational, touching the life of another, just like a candle. I'm just going to bring the candle forward. Being a light. Let's see if I can. I don't know if I can, because wax might. Let's see, you can see the candle there. So being a light unto that darkness is what the emotional world creates. The darkness is the emptiness that people feel when they cannot connect with humanity. And so when you're in a world where so many are detached or pretending or suppressing their emotions, denying what's going on for them, that's the darkness that's within. And yet they might, like Princess Diana, project an image that's happy and fine, great family. Often people get amazed when people suicide because it looks like they had everything, yet they had nothing. Camilla actually said to her, "You've got everything. You've got your children, you've got the life," but she didn't have the love of her husband. And that's where she was dying inside, you see. Because she felt she needed that love in order to be complete. And what I would say at this point is, from when I was going through my difficulties, I started to write poetry more and more. And I started to tap into inner truth more and more. And I realized that the love I was seeking was actually inside myself, or even the healthy human response. It's not even really, I wasn't really even seeking love. What I was seeking was acknowledgement, that I was worth something, that I was worthy of a response, that I existed. It was pretty basic what I was really wanting. But that inner love was what I found. And so it was a gift. It's a gift when you find that inner love. And that inner love is the same as this candle. It's an inner light. I'm going to get the other candle actually, because that may actually show a beautiful light on this. Isn't that lovely? The light. Enlightenment is what happens. You can see a little bit of a halo effect there. That's what happens when you recognize you're the source of the love you seek. I do feel love very intensely from within, and I project it out, which means I treat everybody as my family now. Strangers, everyone. I really do, because I'm not frightened of people. And for me, it's exciting and fun to give something to someone. To make someone's day, for me, is great fun. I might see how this candle looks. I've got a couple of candles here. Let's have a look. Oh, that may be a little bit too low, that one. But it's pretty, isn't it? It's beautiful. Just going to make that go closer. Life is creativity. See the beautiful blue? I wonder where that's coming from. Huh. Don't know. It's lovely. I'll use the other candle instead, I think. So for those who are believing that we need to disconnect the emotional state by creating education along the lines of just science and technology and completely removing humanity, they're removing the greatest part of who they are, in actual fact, who they are. The most extraordinary moments of life is in terms of humans befriending or humans loving one another. That humanity is how we feel one another. That's how we can't harm another. So in respect of non-violence, violence is not possible in space where you actually feel someone, where you actually feel their pain to the extent that you understand you've been there. It's not for you to carry their pain, but it's to feel empathy for that person and then reach out to them and say, I understand. You're not alone. It's not your fault. You're confronting a situation you don't understand and you feel powerless in that situation. And sometimes within powerlessness, you can feel that you can't find your power. And so therefore it feels like you're sinking, or it feels like there's no exit. But really the only way out of it is into yourself, in truth. You have to know thyself and be true. I found poetry was a great inner connector, and it was a wonderful way of expressing my feeling, and I was able to transform negative feeling into positive. That was the gift I gave to myself. And I'm very glad that I persevered in a long-term situation, because I actually needed to find the truth. That was what drove me. I had to know, because I knew that something vital I was learning. Because I'm on the path of peace as well, I dreamed I was teaching peace. So this is all part of my peace work, I felt. Learning to be at peace when confronted with difficulty. Learning to forgive other human beings, allow other human beings to show up in whatever way they do, feeling my feelings and attempting not to impose that on anyone selflessly. I just followed my heart in a lot of ways. And I'm very lucky in the sense that I'm not one of these people that dislikes people. I have a lot of room for understanding within me. But I am a problem solver, so I need to know. what the answer is. I need to find my answer. And I did. The answer for me was that we're role modelling in ways that people are encouraged to not connect to one another. There's a belief in the silence and strength, and not to reveal oneself, because that vulnerability, if you like, is felt more intensely in the emotional area than in the physical area. We're quite underdeveloped emotionally, and we're not having good role models in our lives who teach us how to express our feelings and, creatively connect. Art is really wonderful for that, and music, comedy. For me, poetry was the key. And that connected me spiritually, and that's where I became fulfilled, you see. So I had to break through a lot of these fears, as we all do. We're all tested one way or another. I love the candle, it's beautiful. So Princess Diana knew that from a young child that she was different, and she said that she knew that her life was going to go in a different direction. She knew she wouldn't be queen, she said. And I guess her accident was no mistake I certainly believe it wasn't a mistake. I think it wasn't an accident. I'm quite certain of that. But she obviously had upset people, and there are theories, certainly on the internet, of how and who was involved. Truth always comes out. And as I always tell people, you can't remove a problem. It actually made her more deeply in the hearts of people. And the landmine issue was never forgotten when they took her out. See, that was really unconsciously said just then. I didn't even really think that, but I believe that was part of it. Sadly, we have dynamics on the planet that want to continue on with the violence, and there are others who want to see a peaceful, loving world. I'm certainly in the humanitarian camp. Some could call me political, but I'm actually humanitarian. It's actually my humanity that's moving me into making comment now on things of a political nature, but I see it as part of a democracy. I don't actually see it as political. She said she didn't see herself as political. She saw herself as humanitarian. I would say the same in my own life, definitely. The heart moves me. See, if I was to say nothing and just not contribute, I see a sort of a tacit consent in that. So we're all working it out, I guess, working out what life's about, and I want to learn, I want to understand, because I want to be of service to humanity. And even if it's just doing videos like this, maybe this is the service, maybe this is the extent of it. I don't know. I don't know what my destiny is. I just know that I do feel this light. And it's a form of optimism, you just feel there's so much beauty in this world, And for those who, would like to see a more violent space, I don't feel any discord to them either. My attitude is the world is made up of dark and light. It's like you wouldn't be able to see this candle in the light. It suddenly becomes super bright in the dark. So the dark element, which is the absence of light, and all light is information. The more light in this room, the more you're going to see. That's more information. When you take away the light, could we take away the light? Or really take away the light, like put it wee. See if I can darken things a little bit. I'm obviously not going to be able to darken it completely because this has got light in it. But the absence of light means lack of information, which means you see less and less. Ignorance flourishes in lack of information. That's why secrecy happens. It's a lack of information. Non-disclosure is lack of information. This is receding more and more into the dark, which is obscuring truth. That's why often the light is used as another metaphor for love and truth, because truth is visibility, you see. Truth. And that's what Diana did when Andrew Morton produced her biography. She was bringing light to a subject that she knew had to be spoken, and she had to do it for her own healing as well, because many people had believed it was her fault. They weren't aware that Charles was having an affair and that was destroying their marriage. And of course, the royal family obviously didn't want to confront that it was their son, the Queen's son's fault in that respect. But it was also the Queen and the royal family as well, because they came around that. They must have known about Camilla. I'm sure they would have known. And so they brought this young girl in. So they have much to answer for with the psychological abuse. Abuse is an issue around them. I know that. And that's because they've lived in a lack of light. It's the nature of the austerity under which they have to perform as royals. The royal family wouldn't know freedom. People think, oh, they're lucky they can just get on a plane and go anywhere. They're going to lots of countries and meeting lots of people, but it's a routine. It's a diary that's packed, full of dates. Maybe as the Queen gets older, she might start to experience a little bit of freedom as she retires from public life. But in truth, she actually has been imprisoned herself, as have all of them. They had to be seen to be what the public wanted. But what, throughout that journey of theirs, what happened to them when they wanted something other than the life they had? I think things are loosening up a little bit more now, particularly with the younger ones. But I think in Queen Elizabeth's time, certainly the Queen Mother was a Queen Victoria, who was her grandmother. I think she was a very austere type. And that was her role model. So she was also taught to withhold emotions emotions are not to be shown. So it goes back generations. So love is not through power over, it's through power within. Enlightenment is just information, awakening to the truth of who you are. That's all awakening really is. And as you start to awaken, as you get more informed and more empowered, you start to see that the dark is not so scary. That the dark is needed from the point of view of learning adolescence. Diana would never have found her power had she not gone through a dark time. I would never have written all the poetry that I've written, 1,500 poems I wrote, which was what gave me insight into what I call universal wisdom, that all came from within. Then I realized I'm connected to everything. I couldn't have known that had I not gone through my own darkness. I had to find my own light. I had to find the information. And it had to be true, otherwise I wouldn't have felt healed or felt the joy of those realizations. If I just grabbed onto any bit of information to feel good, it would never have worked. I had to find the truth, you see. That was my liberation, if you like, from that darkness. That's why truth is so essential. It's not a concept, it's an experience. It's actually part of enlightenment. You enlighten yourself by understanding the truth. And if you live your life as a visible person and you're not concealing, you will get to where you need to go faster. That's how we grow. And certainly you could see in the case of Diana in her latter years, she grew into a very mature woman, self-confident and very clear about what she was wanting to do. And when she met with Dodie, I mean, that may well have evoked some anger within the establishment because he wasn't British. He was a Muslim, you know. But Diana followed her heart, you see, and joined with a man that she loved. And that would be really the recommendation for the entire humanity is follow your heart. Do what enlightens you. Be a gift to the world. Be yourself, especially, because that's the gift. And I think, finally, just be a light into the darkness. It's beautiful. Be a light unto the darkness, but curse it not. Isn't that what they say? And what that means is, it is what it is. We're always going to have the dark with the light. It's the yin and the yang of it. So whilst I advocate for peace, I accept that there are those who are not in peace and not into it and not interested in it, and that's their pathway. And I'm not here to change them. I'm just here to bring some more light. And that, for me, is really what homeostasis is all about, balance. See, the yin and the yang symbol are always rotating, always moving, but they are in a state of balance. That's when it's in balance, that's when you grow and expand. The dynamic is created through that contrast. So try not to see people as enemies because they see differently. See them as part of your journey where you're going to expand who you are. So if you're, I mean, I'm certain a person in the dark is not going to call themselves, in the dark. They'll be seeing another as wrong and they'll be right. So whatever way you see it, it doesn't really matter. If you're coming across another who's contrasting with you, welcome that as an opportunity to test out your own beliefs, but curse it not, and don't harm another because they're different from you. If they're in your path, they're meant to be there. And what I would certainly say from a higher level is you've called it forth. We're here to learn, all of us, and forgive it all. Ultimately, I think it's about forgiving what we've judged. So a few moments, we'll just be still. I send love and light to Princess Diana's children and their beautiful spouses and the children that they've had as well, and the royal family who are awakening. And the world is awakening too, in actual fact. Send love to the planet, the earth, to earth systems which are under a great pressure right now. I've heard the wind going pretty crazy outside, and I'll probably upload a video on some footage I took of the climate. Climate reflects our imbalance internally. That's why we're having, on a collective level, climate change. It's because within us we're in turmoil ourselves. We're in a lot of flux and a lot of confusion. I send everybody peace, love, and enlightenment. Be happy.